Okay, on behalf of the Belmas Inclusion Leadership Research Interest Group, in short form RIC, we, the conveners, myself, Dr. Wendy Conrad, and Dr. Beth Holmes, extend a warm welcome to you all. We are actually very delighted to welcome you to this event, and we title it Leadership for Increasingly Diverse Schools. And for this session, we are very pleased to be joined by two very distinguished guest speakers, Prof. George Theoharis and Prof. Martin Scanlan. And just let me introduce both of our speakers. Prof. George Theoharis is a professor in educational leadership and inclusive education at Syracuse University, starting as a kindergarten teacher. Interesting here. He worked as a teacher, a principal, university faculty, and a university administrator, and mostly focused on educational equity. His work emphasizes issues of inclusion, university school partnerships, and leadership for social justice. And this is the bit that I love the most. Prof. George has wrote hundreds of articles and including this book that we are going to talk about today. There is altogether 13 books that he has authored. So that's really, really impressive, George. And we welcome a very warm welcome to you for this event. Our next distinguished speaker is Prof. Martin Scanlan, and he's a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Higher Education at the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. So before joining the academy, Prof. Martin spent over 10 years as a teacher and administrator. He primarily worked in urban settings in schools, serving traditionally marginalized students. So this basically laid a foundation for Prof. Martin's teaching and scholarship interests, which focuses on how schools can be organized to more effectively welcome all students. So Prof. Martin's research primarily focuses on the organizational routines and practices of adults in schools, including the policies, procedures that shape this. So Prof. Martin has an extensive record of scholarship in academic journals reporting this work. So Prof. Martin is also a very impressive background you have here, and we also extend a very warm welcome to you to this event. Um, as a background for all our audience, the premise of the presentation today is actually based on the third edition of both our guest speaker, Prof. George and Prof. Martin's best-selling book titled Leadership for Increasingly Diverse Schools that helps both practicing and aspiring school leaders deepen their knowledge, skills, and dispositions to create schools that best serve all students. So in this book, they purposely argue that seeking to eliminate marginalization requires action, and thus they include ideas and strategies for leadership practice. So, George and Martin, thank you first of all for accepting our invitation. We are all very excited to hear from you. So, let us all together welcome George and Martin.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thanks for having us. And thanks for making time both to be here and for those I know who will be watching later. I'm going to share my screen because Martin and I put together some slides as we discuss. One second. Hopefully everyone can see that.
All good,
Martin,
George.
can you see that? Looks good. Great. All right. So yes, thanks again. We were invited to be here because of the third edition of this book came out this past fall 2025. And it's really been an ongoing project. Clearly, it's the third edition, right? The second edition came out in 2020. The first edition came out in 2015. But this work actually started before that. Martin is one of my favorite collaborators, and we've had a long and lovely relationship that started with some conference presentations and pulling people together to do a special issue around this theme, around inclusivity and intersectionality, right? The different identities that kids and families bring to our schools. And that special issue, I think, led to another special issue and then led to the first edition of this book, which was published in 2015. So the work started really around 2010, 2011 in many ways. And part of I think the beauty of this book is, right, is that we rely on many different authors with many different areas of expertise around identities. Lori Johnson, one of those people on the webinar today, is a co-author of Martin's for one of the chapters and has been part of this for a long, long time, whose work I know Martin and I both greatly admire. And so I think the success of this book really has come from the many voices that it's part of who really bring their expertise. So this today, whether it's morning or afternoon or evening, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do a little welcome and overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to Martin. And we, with many of the authors, made a video to sort of introduce the book. And then we're going to do an official sort of overview of the book, right? The grounding of the book, the framework for it, and then a little bit about the content and structure. We think that's pretty important. And then the culminating feature of the book is an equity audit. And then we'll have some conversation prompts that highlight some of the things and ideas from the book, and lots of time for discussion and question and answer. So that's our plan. Thanks for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Martin.
Thanks so much, George. And I echo the enthusiasm of George to be here and be with you. As George said, we've had 3 editions of this book with lots of different collaborators, and it took us until this 3rd edition to get the idea that, hey, let's try to use some media to reach out and have a greater impact with how we can engage practitioners and fellow scholars. Both of us, George and I, both come from a background of working in schools and in districts. And so we really want to bridge that theory and practice. And we pushed the book to be structured in that way. George had a great idea this round to create a video, and we're going to play that video for you now, so you get to hear a little bit from the people who've participated, and I think we have representatives from every single chapter in this video. So we're going to play that for you, and then tell you a little bit more about an overview of the book itself.
Here we go.
Schools can be incredibly welcoming, affirming communities, and it is not something that you have to invent on your own.
Our book
will help school leaders
engage in practices that lead to more inclusive,
socially just schools.
This book allows us to really conceptualize our children from various vantage points.
We have to think about whole person formation differently.
You have all these elements that kids are bringing with them when they come to a classroom and families are bringing to their schools. These sort of invisible dimensions. You've got religious, socioeconomic status. If you're going to be effective, you have to account for those dimensions.
When I first started doing work in this space, there was hardly anything out there to prepare leaders to be more LGBTQ inclusive. It is kind of like a landmark book.
As we seek to address the inequalities and injustice that exist,
there's massive resistance and backlash to this work.
That resistance and backlash does not change the reality
that schools are increasingly diverse in many ways.
Leaders need to be able to better support their schools,
to better educate each and every child.
Schools have always been asked to do the lion's share of solving our society's problem. Part of the pressure on school leaders right now is this culture war. There's a sense of dehumanizing of certain kids in the school. And there's a desire to not talk about a full history.
We can
include,
support, and affirm all students.
It's about all kids.
We can eliminate homophobia.
We can welcome all families.
All families. Schools play such a central role in bringing together students and families across these different dimensions of diversity.
Leaders can and need to be a key role in a life-changing education for the diversity of kids in our schools.
We try to provide programs, strategies, policies that could be incorporated no matter what state educators are in.
There's a danger in just thinking this is too difficult, this is unattainable.
We need to be in community in order to actually do this work well. So the more that we can start seeing ourselves as leaders of community and seeing other community leaders as counterparts, then we can actually mitigate symptoms of poverty within our actual schools.
You can't make change if you don't actually know which kind of changes you need to be making and where the focus needs to be.
And the culminating feature of the book is an equity audit.
We show how to present the data in a way that makes it really easy to understand, and you can readily see disparities. Being strategic is the most important thing.
We have to be purposeful about meeting an increasingly diverse population.
We can eliminate segregation.
We can create gender inclusive policies, programs, and practices.
And create belonging.
Dismantle racial inequities and practice inclusive leadership.
Ensure children of all racial backgrounds feel welcome.
We can eliminate xenophobia in increasingly diverse schools.
We can support all students with disabilities inclusively
In increasingly diverse schools.
The first time was great, but yeah, only once. So we thought that that would be a great way to kind of introduce you to the book, because there's so many other voices, and that's what, as George introduced our time together, that's really the key. The book is situated in a series, the Educational Leadership for Equity and Diversity series. So Colleen Capper, who was in the video there, and Kevin Lawrence Henry, they are the editors of this series, and the three books are listed there. And so we wanted to give a shout out to Routledge and to the series editors to just draw your attention to that, because we think that as this book is situated there, it's part of this greater corpus of work, or a library of work that's growing from Routledge around issues of equity and diversity, central across the world. But our book itself, we want to talk about the overview of the book itself. So as you saw in the video there's a whole series of chapters, and chapter 1 provides the overview, and it starts off with 3 main points. Chapter 1 and chapter 9 are the 2 bookends of the book, and they both are different. George will introduce the middle chapters, which all follow a similar formula. But chapter 1 and 9 set it up and then wrap it out. So I'm going to talk first about chapter 1. The core expectations of school leaders, social justice and leadership development, and fostering community of practice are the 3 main points that we focus on in this book. During these difficult times around the world, having people go into building level and district or system level leadership is exceedingly difficult, and attracting and retaining people in those positions is exceedingly difficult. And so we start the book talking about that, and about how whether it's through standards or whether it's through the community expectations, the expectations on school leaders are very, very high. And thinking about leadership in terms of leadership in general is the framework for how we think about leadership in increasingly diverse schools. The second part of the book kind of moves into what is social justice leadership development and leadership practices. So in this section, we really talk about some of the barriers that you face as school level leaders and district level leaders when you're in settings that have increasing dimensions of diversity. So the migration patterns are such that linguistic diversity, cultural diversity is growing in both urban and rural regions around the world. We focus this book at the United States, but we think it's applicable, and part of what we want to do in our conversation today is discuss how it is applicable in settings around the world. But in the United States, across all regions of this vast country, school districts and school settings are increasingly diverse, and the issues of equity and how to ameliorate inequities persist and are exacerbated because of that diversity. We also, in this opening section, talk about the assets that this diversity brings. And so not framing diversity as, oh, ain't it awful, something we have to get over, but rather this is the richness of the human experience, the richness of the human family, and how can we see as school level leaders that richness as something that we embrace. So we really want to talk about practices, not just ideas throughout the book. Every book is organized around, every chapter is organized around that. And in this opening chapter, we introduce the different kinds of thinking about leadership practices. And then the third section of this opening chapter talks about leadership in a distributed manner. So it talks about how this is not something that's just an individual, but rather in a sociocultural learning theory perspective, we work and we learn with and through others. We talk about that as communities of practice. And so that's the third kind of feature to tee up the book, to say that you as a school or system level leader are not in that alone, and that leadership, it's not about leaders for increasingly diverse schools. It's about leadership for increasingly diverse schools. There's a purpose in that term, leadership, and leadership is distributed. And that's the third emphasis that we have. I'm going to kick it back over to George, who's going to then give you an overview of those middle chapters between the first and the last.
Thanks, Martin. As Martin said, right, well, this book really focuses on the practice of leadership, right? And as you said, initial introduction, bridging from theory to practice, that bridge is really explicit across the book. And in that opening chapter, it frames this as, right, leadership in terms of developing community, that we don't see leadership as the act of one sole person. And this book actually comes out of that, right? The core part of the book are chapters 2 through 8. And these are people that have been in our community of practice, that we have worked and learned and studied with, now for 10, 15, almost 20 years. And so the lead authors on each of these chapters, right, have been part of our learning in our community and the people that we collaborate with. And so, like, as Martin said, right, the central part of this book, chapters 2 through 8, each focus on a different area or aspect of identity or diversity, seen through an asset, framework that students and families and staff bring to school. Right? So chapter 2 focuses on inclusive leadership and disability. Chapter 3 focuses on inclusive leadership and poverty, or SES, socioeconomic status. Chapter 4 focuses on inclusive leadership and race. Chapter 5 focuses on inclusive leadership and multilingual learners. Chapter 6 focuses on inclusive leadership and LGBTQIA+ and gender expansive identities. Chapter 7 focuses on inclusive leadership and religion. And chapter 8 focuses on inclusive leadership across social ecosystems, family and community engagement. Right? And so each one of these chapters has a similar structure and framework, which we'll talk about in a second. But also embedded across all of these chapters we saw this book really as a 21st century learning tool. Right? There's extended learning to take it off the page in each chapter. There's links, and then it's designed, right, to be part of a community's learning, right, whether it be a university-based class, a school system-based learning opportunity. And so each chapter scaffolds discussion and reflection questions across the chapter, both to engage people to do this reading and learning together. The publisher Routledge, right, has online resources, right, which has then these links. Right, some people, will engage with the book electronically, and the links are then hot. But some of us are still old school, right? We still like the hard copy of the book. And then the Routledge website has all of the links, as well as professional development facilitator guides that pulls all of the questions from each chapter and then all the questions across the book into one place to help for facilitation. As Martin and I both said, right, each of these chapters 2 through 8, right, are structured in the same way, right, to make it more accessible and more readable and more coherent. So each of these chapters, whether it's focusing on disability or race, right, or LGBTQ plus status, start with a current context around that identity, around that area of diversity. And each one of the chapters in that current context includes first-person voices, people who share that identity. The second part of each book is really sort of laying out the theoretical grounding, right? It essentially is, what do we know? What do we know in the literature? And it doesn't do a comprehensive, but it highlights key areas of scholarship that are relevant to that area, right? So in the disability chapter, it's relevant to key areas of scholarship around disability, right? In the race chapter, key areas of scholarship around race, and so on throughout each of those chapters. And the largest part of each of these chapters 2 through 8 is the leader's role, right? Because we want to move from understanding the context and literature to, like Martin said, practices. It's not a how-to book, but it very much emphasizes leadership strategies and practices. And so each of those chapters spends the bulk of the time on, okay, if we understand the context and we understand the literature, what does this mean for our work as school leaders, whether the building or district or system level, right? Focus on practices, strategies. And then each of these chapters has case studies that illuminates, okay, taking up this work looks like this. Taking up this work looks like this, as they wrestle with the practices and strategies that are talked about. Also, clearly on the side, QR code to order the book and to share the video. We want to make that accessible for people to get as much as they can. So to make this a little more evident, I'm going to highlight chapter 2. Chapter 2 is one of the chapters that I'm one of the authors on. And so if we look really at that part 3, where we get into the leadership strategies and practices, chapter 2 around disability, around inclusive leadership and disability, really highlights 10 leadership practices, leader's role, right? And those are listed on the slide, right? That the leader's role is to set a bold, clear vision of inclusion around disability. The leader's role, step 2, then, is to engage in collaborative planning and implementation with their staff, their school staff, their district staff, whatever the staff may be. That the leader sets a direction for inclusivity, and we collaboratively plan and implement. And then the third practice, right, is conducting an equity audit, which Martin will come back to in a minute, because it's the 9th culminating chapter. And we see with disability, the fourth practice is mapping out current service delivery. And you see on the screen this little graphic that has rectangles and ovals and circles and arrows. And that's a service delivery map for one school. It's an elementary school. And the rectangles around the outside represent the classrooms. And then the darker shaded areas, whether they're circles or ovals or a rectangle, represent the special education teachers, right? So it maps out, this is how we're using our resources to serve kids with disabilities. And we find that really important in terms of inclusive leadership around disability, that people understand the bird's eye view, they can see the systemic level. And without doing that, it's really hard for people to understand that. And so then the next practice is to set goals based on the vision. So this is what we currently do, but what would our goals be if we are working to be more authentically inclusive? And then the next step, right, is to then realign our school and staffing structure, right? How can we rethink the way we're serving kids with disabilities, right? Look at the resources we have on our service delivery map. How could we reuse that to move into a more inclusive direction? And that means realigning our staffing structure, right? Creating a new service delivery map. And so that then necessitates what we see as the next practice is building instructional teams, right? If we're using staff differently, we have to build teams differently. If we're moving away from pulling children with disabilities out and isolating them, then we have to work on new kinds of instructional arrangements and new kinds of teaching practices. And then it leads to the next practice is transform classroom practices, which obviously bridges from that one. And part of the leader's role, we have 2 more pieces to leader's role in this chapter. One is that this sort of move to a more authentic, inclusive service delivery and practice means it has to be seen as not one more thing, right? But the way we do things. And so all other initiatives are then looked at as how they can enhance or work into this, as opposed to this is just one of many things we do, which means we can put it aside later, right? It's about unifying all of the demands that come to school leaders. And then the last practice we see around disability and inclusive leadership is this idea of we're gonna continually monitor this. We're gonna adjust. We're not going to abandon our commitment to inclusion. We're not going to throw out our new service delivery. We're going to adjust yearly, and we're going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate our wins. We're going to celebrate our bravery. We're going to celebrate the moves we've made. Like I said, on the other side of the screen, you see an example of the service delivery map. The chapter has multiple examples. And then we end with both school and district case studies that take folks through these 10 practices at the school level and then at the district and system level. Right. So that's just an example of the sort of the breakdown of the practices and how they come to life. In this case, in chapter 2, but it happens in different ways across all of the chapters. So I'm going to throw it back to Martin to get to chapter 9, which is the sort of culminating equity audit, which each chapter 2 through 8 refers to and then builds towards that.
Thanks, George. So I'm going to talk about this, and then we're going to try to pivot over because we really want to make sure that we have time in this time together to have conversation with you all. As we've been talking, this is the third edition of this book, and each edition has sharpened and been updated and been changed in many ways. One of the key ways in which the book has sharpened its thinking, I think, over the different editions is in this 9th chapter, the pitfalls and promise of equity audits. Equity audits are something that are referenced in each chapter. George just talked about chapter 2 on disability, and equity audits are throughout the book referenced, but at this 9th chapter is a focus on all of them and some tools and resources for conducting them. But you notice in that title, the pitfalls and promise of equity audits. So it's framed that equity audits are not a silver bullet that's going to fix everything, and this is what everything revolves around, and this is the great saving grace is conducting an equity audit. A good friend and colleague who's cited in the book and who I draw upon a lot, Terrence Green, at a presentation many years ago on equity audits, used a powerful metaphor. And he said, an equity audit is like a smoke detector. And the smoke detector is good to tell you about something's wrong, but it doesn't put out the fire. Okay, so yes, it's an essential tool, but it's only one tool. And in different ways, an equity audit, it does that. It helps us draw attention to a problem and problems. In the video at the beginning, as Colleen and George were describing it, they use these phrases about being strategic and being purposeful in the data. And that's what equity audits are about. But of course, they don't tell us exactly what to do. They help us move in that direction. So we talk about 4 phases for equity audits. First, establishing a team to conduct the equity audit. So remember back in that opening chapter, we talked about communities of practice. Well, that theme goes throughout, and this notion that this is not something that's an individual effort. Oftentimes in graduate school classes, we have individuals who are in our class and practice doing some of the behaviors of conducting an equity audit. But establishing the team is really a key feature that we focus on in the book, that for the efficacy of an equity audit, it cannot be an individual endeavor. It needs to be shared perspectives and distributed labor involved in. Phase 2 is gathering and analyzing data. An equity audit gathers data across multiple dimensions of identity and looks at where are students and where's participation represented across those different dimensions of identity. So to give us a holistic view of what is happening in our co-curricular activities, what is happening in our discipline policies, what is happening in our academic learning, what is happening in who is engaged in what ways in the school community's governance structures. So the equity audit, the data is this holistic view. George went through chapter by chapter saying, we're looking at disability, we're looking at social economic status, we're looking at religion, we're looking at family engagement. And the equity audit takes those different areas and allows you to focus in on what kinds of data are there and how do we think about it. So gathering and then thinking, the analyzing about the data. The third phase is discussing that data with the school and the district staff. So this is a book that's written in the United States, and so we often our schools are organized in districts. But the idea that the school community and the greater system in which that school community is nested, they need to be processing that data. So it's not something that's internally focused, but it's something not for just the leadership team, but it's something for the broader community to discuss that data. And then the key, of course, is the next steps. What do we do with these data? Where do we start? What's the first or the initial steps to ameliorate some of the inequities, and how do we keep going? So the equity audit has that as the promise. The pitfalls are that it's just a smoke detector on the wall and calling attention, ain't it awful, these disparities. But the promise is what we can do about it. A final point about that equity audit to call attention to is the representation of data. So we often have a kind of a sense that, hey, maybe in our family engagement, we kind of have a sense of who's engaged, and we have hunches about that, but we don't actually know with specificity who is actually engaged and how are they engaged. So what the equity audit does across, whether it's family engagement or religious diversity or socioeconomic or race or LGBTQIA, all the different dimensions of identity that are addressed in the book, is it helps school and system level leaders think with more specificity about what are the actual numbers that we have, so that it's not just these hunches, but it moves from these generalized conversations to much more specific ones. Oftentimes, when I'm working with students, say they come to talk about an article and they talk about it in general. And I say, no, let's look at the book and what specifically was said. And so that specificity can ground the conversation and they can help move it forward. And then the representation of the data. How do we show what we're talking about? That facilitates the internal thinking, and it also facilitates the external showing of those data. So that's chapter 9 that all the chapters contribute to and lead to. And I think we're going to kick it back to you now, George, I think we're moving into the conversation part, right? Are we?
Yeah, we're moving to the conversation part. In part, as we move into that, part of the main point of this book is this idea that when we know better, right, we can do better. We're not just smarter, but then our practice can get better. And so if we take, this is an example, right, of a district that took this up, and in their equity audit data, right, looking around disability, they realized some things that they weren't conscious of, that their population at their school, at their district, 21% of their students were labeled in special education. In the United States, the national average is 14. So they realized, whoa, we are already exceeding that. And then another piece of data that really struck them is that 40% of their students with disabilities were being placed in self-contained, or what we might call segregated special ed rooms, right? Rooms only for kids with disabilities. And that compared to the state rate of 23%. And so they realized, well, wait a minute, we are placing way more kids in self-contained or segregated special ed than even the state average. And they looked further, right? The equity audit asked us to break this data down. And they said, well, 35% of our enrollment are Black students, but 60% of the kids in the self-contained setting are Black students. And so this is like what Martin and our colleague Terrence Green talk about as the smoke detector. Like, well, this is clearly an issue, right? Where 35% of our district is Black, but the majority of kids in the self-contained room, and we're putting too many kids already in these spaces, are Black. And so that knowing better allowed them to do better. So they created service delivery maps, right, which led to service delivery change, because when they asked better questions, they could lead to more strategic decisions. This sort of service delivery change was not on their radar until they really engaged in this kind of data collection. And then, as Martin laid out, this kind of conversation, and then this kind of planning. It wasn't just we're gonna, oh, look at these problems, we're not gonna admire them. They then engaged in how can we change our system to be more inclusive. And this is just a small example, right, of this. The main point of this book is if we know better, right, we can then actually do better and create better systems. So let's talk about the implications of this main point. And we just wanted this as a conversation prompt, right? We want to talk about in what ways does understanding different identities better allow us to ask different questions and collect different data. And a second question with that, in what ways can collecting different data lead to different decisions? So we wanted to pose those because we felt we've talked enough. We wanted to pose those to the group to have conversations about both these questions, right? What ways does different understanding different identities better allow us to ask different questions and collect different data? And in what ways can collecting different data lead to different decisions? And we want to talk about that with the folks on this call, from your perspectives, through your experience. So we just want to open it up.
Right. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Martin. And thanks for these two very probing questions that we have here. Anyone would like to respond? We can start some conversations.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. I think from the first question, actually knowing what questions to ask to actually gain that understanding, or where that understanding actually comes from. So it's not about, we need to reflexively sort of look at our own interpretation of the answers that we are getting when we are trying to understand where different people are coming from, their position before their identities. I think that's so important that we can erroneously place our own interpretation on what we perceive to be their identity to be and their identity to mean. And I think it's really important to ask the questions before we ask the second round of questions in order to collect different data. So to actually, to have time to actually reflexively explore this prior to collecting the data, I think is really important.
Good point there, Wendy.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. And I think that that's a big piece of it, that for all of us as educators, our own interpretations are just that, our own interpretations. And so that invitation to the different perspectives can really invite in expansiveness beyond our own interpretations.
It's interesting. My research that I undertook apart from my doctorate, one of the biggest challenges was the label of refugee or asylum seeker, that we make these assumptions about the past of these children and what these children went through and what the families went through. And then one of my participants, they spent 14 years being treated, and I say that very loosely, for PTSD, where actually it's completely misdiagnosed. And it was only when we sort of really explored the background of the family and where that child was coming from. She got her autism diagnosis, but it was literally 11 years of fighting for that family to actually get that correct. So it's about those, just questioning our assumptions. It's a big one for me.
Yes, can I just come in there? I think it's really quite important to understand where and I agree with what was said about you come with certain issues or positions. I have to be from time to time quite careful because I'm an albino, I have disabilities, etc., and I had to fight that all my life. There's no question about it. And I think that you have to be aware of when you become a academic, you're going to try and have a baseline so that you know when you're doing a conceptual framework that you're going to be clear why you're doing it and how you're choosing it, and you know that you don't want to go down a road of self interest rather than actually doing a piece of research. So I agree with all that. However, one of the big problems that I would say is in America and here, and that is that inclusion is nowhere yet. To be honest, it isn't. We have just had a white paper, and we are still going down a road where children and students who are disabled or having what we call SEN requirements, it means that it may well be that parents had to fight to get their children on a register so they can actually get decent research support. And this is what's happening now. And I do not see, certainly in Britain, it's not going to, well, even the government is saying it's going to be 10 years to actually change things for a lot of people. I would imagine this is the same in America. But I would say that schools have tried their best, but at the end of the day, the bottom line comes down to money. And if we do not have more than 4 billion, you need more than that for children in disabilities or poverty. You need more than that. It's a minor amount of monies really to change. And I think that's happening in America. I would imagine it's happening around the world. It seems to me that on the whole, equity is fine. Equality is important. There you go.
So, Stephen, I'm really glad that you're sharing about that. And George, maybe skip to the next slide. You bridge us to another, so we can continue to talk about those data questions that George prompted. But we also wanted for you to think about and to invite you into what you just started to lead us down, thinking about these questions, that the questions and the structure that the book lays out in terms of how to think about equity and equality, and what are the constraints, the resource constraints, et cetera. How does this framing, as you heard George and I present this framing, how does this work in your context? How does this framing work for increasingly diverse schools in your context? And what do you see as some affordances and constraints of how we presented this? So I wonder if others, Stephen, yourself, or if others in the conversation today might want to respond and build from those remarks.
Thanks, Martin. I think my observation, especially with studies, especially in the Southeast Asian context, is the framing of students with disabilities. So that's the issue. So often students with disabilities are only focused on students with special education needs. And but where in the West context is much broader than that. So much of the research on inclusive leadership is focusing on special education needs, resources on special education needs, assessment on special education needs. So a lot of that framing itself on when we talk about inclusive leadership, it's about schools for students with disabilities. But from this book, and from what we know from in the Western context, it's much more broader than that. So understanding about what it means leading diverse schools is important, because just putting a label or a frame on disability and saying that that's inclusive leadership and that's inclusive schools is problematic by itself.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, right? And in some ways, what I'm hearing is the sort of road that folks in the US have traveled down, right? That this idea of inclusive leadership, here, right, in the United States, came out of a tradition of special education and disability, right? And that's the identity or area of diversity that's most associated with, which is like what I just heard you say, Donnie, right? And that part of the challenge is then to expand it to talk about, well, what does inclusivity mean across identities, right? And when we're such a work in progress about that, we're really lovely and thoughtful in many ways, and really I would say horrible in other ways, right? I mean, we're a bunch of contradictions. And I specifically in the disability area, there are many. I've been in hundreds of schools that take up the mantle that yes, we are an inclusive school, and as Stephen said, people are working really hard, and there's all kinds of systems within that schools and attitudes that are really exclusionary, right? We see these set of kids as being the kids we're going to include, but these kids we can't include, right? Or we won't include because we're not thinking about them in the same way. And so we use that word inclusivity, at least in the States, as often a wall, right? We're about inclusion in this context for these kids and not about these kids, right? And so I really appreciate you sort of saying, well, our challenge in your part of the world, as it is here, really is to think about it broader and to push ourselves and push those around us.
And just following up on that, George, I think one of the challenges that we face here, especially in the Southeast Asian context, is that how do we measure whether a leader is practicing inclusive leadership? So if we look at other types of leadership practices and styles, each of them comes with its own instruments. Transformational leadership, you have its own instrument. Instructional leadership, you have its own instrument. But largely, a lot of inclusive leadership studies and research has been largely qualitative in nature. And so how do we go about, progressing from this front, from a qualitative to something that is much more tangible and measurable?
I think that's a great question. Go ahead, Laurie.
Yeah, I just want to follow up because I'm a BELMAS member. I've been a BELMAS member for over 10 years, and I have an honorary appointment at the University of Nottingham. So I go over in the summer. And so I do think this book can apply to a UK context. And I think one of the really wonderful things about this book is that it's inclusive across all of these dimensions because it helps the reader and the students really think across all of these identities in a way that a lot of literature doesn't. And I'm just thinking about just this week, I don't know if you know, but BELMAS had another session just a day or two ago about what you all call EDI, which we would call DEI. And it was limited to race, gender, and LGBTQ issues. There was no paper presented on disabilities.
Yes, I found that. Yeah, I found that too.
And I thought to myself, gee, that wouldn't it be nice if,
I wasn't happy.
if the rig was more inclusive so that and I'm actually on the race rig, which usually only has presentations on race. So it's something that BELMAS can really think about too, about thinking across these identities. And it's not that the US often does that as well, which George and Martin would of course know that, is that we don't, in our SIGs or our rigs, or we don't often bring together this sort of broader inclusive context. So that is really a unique aspect of this book. Frankly. Were you there, Stephen? Were you at that one as well?
Yes, I was. And actually, I had a concern about it because there was no time, ever so limited time, for any feedback. There wasn't any time. And I didn't like the way it was set out. There were 6 sessions in it. It was 2 hours.
Right.
And not like what we're doing now. Didn't have that. Not really. It's about 5 minutes. And I thought, I won't be doing this again. That I don't, probably not, but I didn't feel very happy at the time. And the point that you made was absolutely essential, and that was there was nothing about disabilities whatsoever.
So what I want to say here is that I really appreciate, Laurie, the point about these different dimensions. And what we try to do with the book is use it as a conversation starter. So there's lots of resources in the book, discussion and reflection questions. And I saw Jose Manuel Amastica's Amestica's comment in the chat about opportunities for critical thinking with leaders and thinking about creating space for that critical reflection and dialogue so to surface. These different dimensions of identity are ones, some of which we're familiar with, some of which we're not familiar with, some of which we've become familiar with. So maybe I'm developing a disability and all of a sudden I'm entering that community in a manner that I really wasn't aware of and wasn't attuned to before. Maybe I'm changing my religious affiliation. Maybe my own relationship with a family member who is an immigrant changes my perspective. So we can change. There's certain dimensions of our identity that are hard and fixed and fast, and other dimensions of our identity that change and evolve. But this notion of community and the critical thinking, as Jose brings up, with other leaders is really an important piece and something that we hope that the book invites. That's why we have the supplementary resources that are available online to really guide it. We want it to be a conversation starter and a tool that you can use in a school and in a system of schools, not just off at the university level, but really with the practitioners and the family and community members.
I think to build on what Martin's saying, I know we have to wrap up in a minute, right, is this idea that it's actually our responsibility. Right? I think that's the book is a tool for that, but it's our responsibility to look across these areas. Some of us, our life's work has been around race, and we know that will only get us so far, and that we'll continue to fail the kids of our countries. They'll continue to fail the people that we produce. They'll continue to fail the kind of research we produce, because we have a responsibility to look across all the ways that kids are different in increasingly diverse schools. And I think raising the bar for ourselves is really important. And those of us who do leadership development, raising the bar for future and current leaders is essential. And that we can't just be comfortable with one area, with understanding socioeconomic status or being comfortable in the LGBTQ plus space, right? That is a responsibility to look across and to think and to question and to learn. And I think that's one of my favorite things about this book is the broad understanding, and that it actually scaffolds some learning for everybody. Because we know most of us don't know a lot about the breadth, and it's our responsibility to take that up, because without that, our schools, particularly in the States, will and have always continued to fail certain kinds of kids.
Yeah.
Thanks, George, for the reflection. I think that one of the most critical element that comes to my mind, especially, is how do we interpret inclusive leadership in a centralized context? George, your chapter 2 indicates that setting a bold vision, but in a centralized education system, the mission and vision is set by the ministry, and that's where compliance comes in. So that's where it becomes a little bit challenging to set the vision and goals, because you're just complying. So I think looking at how a centralized education system interprets inclusive school and diverse schools and inclusive leadership is worth exploring. And as what you and Martin have highlighted, this book is definitely a conversation starter. Yeah. So any final thoughts, Wendy, before we wrap up our session?
I just want to say thank you to both of you. I've bought the book.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's yes, it's certainly an area that's close to my heart, and yeah, I'll be interested to see what this book, sort of does, and moving forward with it. As you say, it's a continual development, so it's all very exciting.
And George, you want to share a little bit about the purchase of the book and what books that comes along with it for today?
Absolutely. Just before we wrap up, right, again on the screen, the top QR code is to order the book. And the publisher Routledge made a special discount for the Belmas presentation. So if you take down that code, it's a 20% discount. That's just for this group and your members, right? So that they can use that. Martin, I forget how long that code can be used. I think for the rest of this month, but I'm forgetting.
Yep, I think it's for the rest of this month.
Yep. And the bottom QR code is then for the video, right? So feel free to share the link to the video, right? We think it's a lovely introduction to the many voices in the book, as well as the link to the book to order, to use. And one of the things you'll see on the Routledge website, which was it was brief at the end of the video, is that Martin and I are very interested in engaging with people who use the book. So the Routledge website says any group that has 10 or more uses 10 or more copies of the book, we're happy to do this kind of thing, right? To do a Zoom question and answer, a Zoom dialogue with. So thanks so much for having us. This has been delightful, and we appreciate all your insights about the book, and we actually love to hear the enthusiasm for it. So that's very heartwarming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, George. Thanks a lot, Martin. And thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us. I've actually gone one step further. I've actually asked my university library to actually order few copies of it so that, it could be shared across different subjects and different students. So, yeah, and definitely I'm getting our own copy with this discount today. So thank you, George. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Laurie and Stephen, Yosei, Michimasa. We can't see you, but thank you for joining us here. And thanks, Wendy. And it's another great event. We will share the recording across the Belmas website, and we look forward to engaging in future dialogues as well. So thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.